Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of What's Going On. I'm your host, Tom D'Ambra. Folks, we're going to call this Correlations 2, part number 2, because this is a bit of a continuation of our discussion last broadcast with regards to the who's, the what's, and the whens of what's going on currently. And what we meant by the word correlations was we're actively taking a look at the desires of the private bank that we know as the Federal Reserve when the act was drawn up, when the mechanisms, the guides, the operations, directions were with regards to the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, what were they trying to do? What were they trying to gain control of, and what was their goals as this process developed and went on? So we all know from watching this show, because you didn't learn this in the public fool system, that the Federal Reserve is a private foreign bank. And as you know from watching this show, it is literally a cartel. And I thought it would be a good idea to start right there with what is the definition of a cartel? So I wanted to read this to you. Excuse me. A cartel is a group of independent businesses which join together to coordinate the production, pricing, or marketing of their members. The purpose of a cartel is to reduce competition and thereby increase profitability. This is accomplished through a shared monopoly over their industry, which forces the public to pay higher prices for their goods or services than would be otherwise required under a free enterprise competition. I think that definition is one of the best that I've ever read of a cartel. And folks, what industry are we speaking of? We are obviously speaking of money, or the lack of, commerce, credit. This is what we're speaking of. So a cartel is a group of independent businesses which join together to coordinate the production, pricing, and marketing of their members. The purpose of the cartel is to reduce the competition and increase profitability. And this is accomplished through a shared monopoly over the industry, and again, the industry being money and credit and commerce, which forces the public to pay higher prices for their goods and or services. Now, in this instance, folks, it's both. And it's multiple, many time fold. And we're going to get into the reasons why. Than would otherwise be required under a free enterprise. Okay, so we have a group of people who meet at Jekyll Island in 1911 and 1912. They meet secretly, and then they draft up this act called the Federal Reserve Act, and it was be known as the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. And as we've discussed before, this act was put in secretly on December 23rd, 1913, while the Congress was away. And President Wilson, who was placed into power by the bankers, he has a confession about this act that he implemented, he signed off on, and it's called his deathbed confession. And we're going to read that towards the end of the show, if we have the time, and you can get an understanding of President Wilson's observations of what took place to his nation by his actions. So when they went to Jekyll Island, again, this powerful group assembles, and there was 5 things that they laid out that they wanted to be sure to have control of and or implement through these acts. The 5 goals, if you would, of what this legislation was going to bring to them. Not to you, but to them. Okay, and this is their own notes, folks. This is from their own notes taken at this event. Number 1, how to stop the growing influence of small rival banks and to ensure the control of the nation's financial resources would remain in the hands of those present. Now, I want you to listen to the language. How to stop the growing influence of small rival banks and to ensure that control over the nation's financial resources would remain in the hands of those present. What are they telling you? Folks, they've already got control. Not to the extent of today, but they have a percentage, a mechanism of control already established. And they're losing it. And what they were losing it to was the small state-chartered banks. Because that's what we get down to here, the charter. The banks in 1913 were overwhelmingly, small state-chartered banks. Today, they are all chartered through a private bank called the Federal Reserve. So, did they accomplish that goal? Absolutely. Folks, there's only 2 state-chartered banks in the entire country now. That's North and South Dakota. Number 2, how to make the money supply more elastic in order to reverse the trend of private capital formation and to recapture the industrial loan market. What are they after here? Think of this. To the trend of private capital formation, in other words, they want to control the implementation and mechanisms that create the trend of private capital influx into the economy. The private lending through these small rival banks that they spoke about in issue number 1. And to recapture, in other words, they had it one time and then they lost it. And I'm going to tell you when they had it and when they lost it. They had it prior to Andrew Jackson, and they lost it because of Andrew Jackson. And to recapture the industrial loan market. In other words, they want to control the credit of the industrial commerce in this country. Now, I ask you, have they done that? Absolutely. They not only control the issuance of the credit for the commerce, folks, they got you bailing them out on the facade the whole thing failed. And it's not a facade that it failed, it's that the mechanisms were a facade. So, have they controlled, do they control the formation and trends of private capital? Absolutely. There is no private capital. They've absorbed it all. And have they recaptured the industrial loan market? Folks, if you're an industrialist, if you're trying to open up a mom and pop sandwich shop and you need a loan, where are you going to get a loan without the FDIC and the Federal Reserve banking system? It does not exist. Doesn't exist. You can go in the back of some of these financial magazines and you'll see, loans, that type of thing. And you may say, oh, well, I can get a loan through this private lender. And that may be true. That very well may be true. Of course, they're not really a private lender, are they? And the reason why I say that, my friends, is because ask yourself, what are they using for a medium of exchange? They are using the private Federal Reserve note as a medium of exchange. Do they have control of anything? No. And think of this, folks. Let's say I want to open up a sandwich shop. I need $100,000. 100,000 Federal Reserve notes. We still call them dollars. I need $100,000. So I'm going to go to this private lender, and the private lender is going to issue, if everything works out okay, is going to go ahead and issue me this credit. Folks, I am going to have to pay the private lender, and then for every Federal Reserve note, which is now 100,000 of them, there is also an interest due on that $100,000, but not to the private lender, folks, to the people who gave us credit to print the $100,000, and that is the Federal Reserve banking system. Now, there's a thing in this country called the M3, and the M3 is the money supply itself. And when we had the Roaring '20s, they issued all this credit to everybody, and they had plenty of money and plenty of credit, got everybody in debt, much like the '90s, got everybody in debt. And now, folks, they are extracting actual currency from the circulation. The M3 is being shrunk, just like in the '30s when we had the Great Depression. Same thing. So, have they accomplished issue number 2? Absolutely, and they're beyond it. Number 3, how to pool the meager reserves of the nation's banks into one large reserve so that all banks will be motivated to follow the same loan-to-deposit ratios. This would protect at least some of them from currency drains and bank runs. Folks, the loan-to-deposit ratio, let's talk about that. In the days of sound money in this country, a bank, if a bank was to lend $10 to you, the bank had to have in its reserves $10 of intrinsic value. And in this country, the intrinsic value would have been gold or silver. And that's why in the old days, folks, when we have certificates for our medium of exchange, you could go to that bank and it would say right on it, bearer redeemable in 1 ounce of whatever it may be, gold and or silver, because there was 2 different types of certificates. But you knew, and the people knew, and the transaction was whole because there was an intrinsic value backing that commodity, that medium of exchange. And that was the gold or silver. But the gold or silver has all been swindled away by this very same private bank called the Federal Reserve. There is no more intrinsic value backing our medium of exchange. It's fact. There's no debating that. It's a note. We took out our Black's Law Dictionary on many a show, and we demonstrated to you, number 1, what money was and what it wasn't. And we demonstrated to you in law that we do not have money. By the definition of money, we do not have money because money does not encircle notes, instruments of debt, because there's no intrinsic value there. So for every time that we go take out a loan, it's merely a ledger. And how the mechanics of it works, and I know bankers hate to have you understand this, is that you have to put up a collateral of something. And did you ever notice that when you sign your note, the banker will have you sign the promissory note, and then the banker will issue you the funds? Well, folks, what is our money system? Notes. So you just promised to pay this bank with collateral backing this $10 in a certain amount monthly, at a certain interest rate monthly, at a certain term for the life of the loan. All the bank does, folks, is take your promissory note, because you promised to pay them. They put it on their books as an entry, as in a positive, because you promised to pay them. It's notes coming in with collateral backing. And then they take that very same entry and they put it against the negative entry that they have issued you the funds with. What a scam. The bank does not have any gold or silver in its vaults, my friends, to back up your loan. None. The bank is operating on a fractional banking system. And what that means is this. For every dollar of obligation loan that they write, they have to have a fractional reserve of these same worthless pieces of paper. And when it first started, you know, it was down to 80%. Then I believe it went to 64%. And then, anyway, folks, we are down to a 2% fractional banking system currently. And what that means is this, to be very blunt. For every dollar that the bank lends out, they have 2 cents of backing put away for it. Think of that. For every dollar that they lend out, they have to have 2 cents somewhere on a ledger that says they got 2 cents put away in a piggy bank on your dollar for every one. That's the fractional banking system. That's what they're talking about here. Number 2, how to control the credit of commerce. Number 3 is to implement this policy so that they can control it. And here's how they're going to control it without them costing anything. Folks, really, what liability is the bank really taking on? You've created the asset. You've given it to the bank. They've made an entry on their ledger that everyone in law and in society accepts. And then they cut you a check with your entry, with your creation. And besides all that, if you cannot meet the terms of this obligation, they've got the collateral behind them, and then they're going to extract that from you also. So what is the risk to the bank? The risk to the bank is merely a numbers game, and we're going to get into some quotes about this. It's merely a numbers game. That's all it is. Because they have to come up with 2%. You create the asset. Everyone acknowledges it on both sides of the contract, and then they reap the benefits of the interest, the principal, and if all else fails, the worst things they're going to wind up with is the collateral, whether it be your car, your house, or whatever that you put up to substantiate the loan. Okay. Should this, folks, this is great. Should this lead to the eventual collapse of the whole banking system? How about they should have put when? Because when you study their own language, they knew what the end result was going to be. And believe it or not, folks, one reason why they wanted and needed an income tax, because the so-called 16th Amendment, the so-called income tax amendment, was also brought in 1913 by the very same bankers. And the reason why is they had to have control of the money system. They had to be able to take money out of the system should inflation begin at such a rate that the people would go, oh my, the lights are coming on. And if that took place, how would they be able to extract revenue of these worthless pieces of paper as the system went on and they got more devalued? How would they be able to extract the revenue from the system so it wouldn't be flooded to create the hyperinflation? And how they did that was they needed an income tax. They needed you to voluntarily contract with one of their agencies called the Internal Revenue Service and request to have money taken out of your pay and to subject yourself to a thing called the IRS code. And I did say voluntary. In their own code, the language is quite clear. The income tax is voluntary. And if you remember, we discussed the Grace Commission, which discovered that not one penny of your income tax goes to the operations of the government. Incredible. So let's just continue with this goal. Should this lead to the eventual collapse of the banking system, which is what we're experiencing now, then how to shift the losses from the owners of the banks to the taxpayers. Folks, this is their own writing. This is their own writing. Have they accomplished this? Well, let me see. $28.3 trillion in cash and credit given to these very same bankers with no accountability. Have they accomplished these first 4 out of the 5? Absolutely. And they've gone beyond it. Absolutely. Okay, what's the last one? I love this one. How to convince Congress that the scheme is a measure to protect the public. Folks, this is incredible because they're actually coming out and saying, how are we going to convince Congress that the scheme is a measure to protect the public? They know it's a scheme to bleed us. They know it's a scheme to extract all the intrinsic value out of our nation as a whole, gold and silver, property. How to convince the Congress the scheme is a measure to protect the public. Incredible, in their own writing. So what did they do? You know what they did? Of course, they started to control a lot of the, especially in 1924, they really took hold of a lot of the media in this country. And we got into that a little bit on some shows. Someday we're going to do a show just just on the media of the world in the United States. But they took a lot of control of it, and it was through J.P. Morgan's and Associates. And what they did basically was they realized they could not control all the major newspapers, print, if you would, of the country. So what they did was they concentrated on I think it was the top 24 or 28. And I ask for your forgiveness, I don't have this number quite down, but it was in that window. It was either 24 or 28. And they realized, gee, if we can just, because so many of these small newspapers, besides little dibby local news, but the major issues of the day, a lot of the hundreds of small newspapers will get their information from the New York Times and Post and so forth. So they went after the control of them hierarchy machines of the press. And what they discovered was that through the UPI and through the AP, wow, we can control all the print. And then as electronic media came on in its incubation days, they were in it from the very beginning because they saw the potential here. Folks, if Hitler had a TV in every living room, he wouldn't have needed all the guns. They've got the American people pretty much where they want them without too many shots being fired. We have had some horrific events. Kent State, Ruby Ridge, Waco, Bakersfield, California, 9/11. Actually, the Twin Towers ×2, because you got the event, what was it, 95, where admittedly the FBI was behind the operation. You go to Ted Gunderson's website, he has all that for you. So they knew from the beginning they had to convince the Congress that the scheme was a measure to protect you. Of course, that's why they put it in secretly, too. That's why they put it in secretly while the Congress was away for the Christmas holiday. So let's get into some quotes about this Federal Reserve Act. Okay? And this is from one of the Rothschilds brothers of London in 1863. Of course, this is my famous quote that I very much enjoy, and I think it hits home. This is from Amschel Rothschild. Give me control of a nation's currency. I care not who makes its laws. You've heard me say that quote a million times on the show, and the reason why is because it hits home to what is so true. Now, this quote is also from Rothschild, and he's talking about that class. This is when he's talking about you and I, okay? The few who understand the system will either be so interested from its profits or so dependent on its favors that there will be no opposition from that class. Now, Barry Goldwater, let's jump ahead. Most Americans have no real understanding of the operation of the international money lenders. The accounts of the Federal Reserve System have never been audited. It operates outside the control of Congress and manipulates the credit of the United States. James Garfield, before he was assassinated. Whoever controls the volume of money in any country is absolute master of all industry and commerce. Let me ask you, is the Federal Reserve and the private banks, are they in charge of all industry and commerce in this country? Absolutely. There can be no doubt about that. There's no even discussion about that. Banks lend by, this is Ralph Hawtrey, Secretary of the British Treasury. Banks lend by crediting credit. Ledger entry credit, monetizing debt. They create the means of payment out of nothing. We just told you how they do it. You make the entry, you create the asset, they make the entry in their ledger, and then they give you something that says you can go collect your creation. Okay. To expose a $15 trillion ripoff of the American people by the stockholders of the 1,000 largest corporations over the last 100 years would be a tall but necessary order of business. Buckminster Fuller. Every congressman, every senator knows precisely what causes inflation, but can't and won't support the drastic reform to stop it, which is the repeal of the Federal Reserve Act, because it would cost him his job. Do you remember when Congressman Sherman said, he came out and said that we were told that if we did not pass this legislation, he was talking about the bailout bill, which gave them trillions of dollars, that, and I quote, the sky would fall and there would be martial law in the United States by morning. Go on the internet, punch in Congressman Sherman warns of martial law. You can watch it yourself. This is on the congressional floor, folks. This is in the House of Representatives. And how do you know it's the House of Representatives? Well, you see the big two fascia symbols behind you. Isn't that something? The international symbol of fascism hangs in the hall, in the congressional House of Representatives floor. Look behind the Speaker of the House. You'll see the flag, and then you'll see these two big brown fascia. Look it up. You'll see it when Congressman Sherman speaks. You can kill two birds with one stone. You'll see what system they're under, and you will listen to Congressman Sherman speak of, and I quote, the sky will fall and there will be martial law in America by the morning. Okay, so with this quote, every congressman has said no specifically request inflation, but can't and won't support the drastic reforms to stop it, which is the repeal of the Federal Reserve Act, because it would what? It would cost him his job. And now you think you have control of the Congress. Folks, you have no control. We have no control as a nation, as a people, as an electorate, to any position at the federal level. Zero. There's not one. There is not one. Not one. And Robert Hunkin is telling you this. He's telling you this, that anyone who tried to repeal the Federal Reserve Act would cost him his job. Who is in control of the Congress? Is it you and I? No. It's the bankers. It is well the people of this nation do not understand our banking or monetary system, for if they did, I believe there would be revolution before tomorrow morning. Henry Ford. The regional Federal Reserve banks are not government agencies, but are independent, privately owned, and locally controlled corporations. Now, this comes from the Ninth Circuit in 1982. This is Lewis versus United States, 68 F. 2nd, 1239 Ninth Circuit Court, 1982. We have in this country one of the most corrupt institutions the world has ever known. I refer to the Federal Reserve Board. This evil institution has impoverished the people of the United States and has practically bankrupted our government. It has done this through the through corrupt practices of the moneyed vultures who control it. Congressman Louis T. McFadden in 1932. Listen to his words. They have practically bankrupted our government. It has done this through the corrupt practices of the money vultures who control it. Practically bankrupt our government in 1932. Folks, what happened in 1933? They did bankrupt our government. March 9th, 1933, we read the entire legislation, Senate, federal, and private entries on the bankruptcy of the corporation that you call the United States. Louis T. McFadden was in charge of the Banking and Currency Commission in them days. Do you think he had an understanding of what was going on? Absolutely he did. He was one of the biggest broadcasts of warning, him and Senator Lindbergh, during this period. And Mr. McFadden, folks, this isn't wacko information. This is true. This is historical fact, was poisoned to death. And it was their third known attempt at his life. There are some other prominent people who have been assassinated. President Garfield, President Lincoln, and most recently, President Kennedy, through the acts of the private banksters. But think of that. Here is the chairman of the Banking and Commerce Committee telling the American people in 1932 that they have practically bankrupted us. What happens in 33? Oh my God, they did. They did bankrupt us. And we've been bankrupt ever since. And this is why I say to you folks, all we do is elect officials to an insolvent corporation. That's all we do. In 1871, with the Organic Act of 1871, folks, the federal government became a corporation. We've read this verbatim to you, and if I'm being a little redundant to our viewers who have seen that show, I apologize. But we get viewers every week. We gain more viewers, and so a lot of people haven't seen all this information. So please be with me here. So what happened is this corporation, folks, and I am talking a corporation, went insolvent to another corporation in 1933. And so all we do is elect officials to an insolvent corporation. That's all we do. Now, ask yourself, if you're the CEO or president of this insolvent corporation, are you going to answer to the stockholders and or voters of this corporation? Or are you going to answer to the creditors who are keeping my ship afloat? I think you just answered that question for yourself. You have to answer to the creditors. You have to play their game because they're the ones that are keeping you in operation. Otherwise, all they got to do is say no more credit, and it all goes for naught. It all goes through the floor. It's over. So ask yourself, you know, and folks, this is how some of all these crazy legislations and bills get in. Because they are not answering to you, the bank of bailout. The average poll that I saw was in the 80s to 90% of the people that didn't want it. What happened? It went through anyway. Gee, what a surprise. It burdens you with 28 and your children with $28.3 trillion worth of debt. And think of this, my friends. Now we have to pay these people, the very same people who received the $28.3 trillion globally, because it has now come out that $3.3 trillion went to foreign banks and foreign institutions. Gee, funny how that wasn't mentioned when they were looking for the money, huh? But we have to pay them, the very same people who got the $28.3 trillion, now we have to pay them an interest on top of that. The loan, we have to pay them an interest because they gave us permission to print the money in the first place to give to them. Can you say scam? Can you say scam? Why do you accept this? Maybe you didn't understand the mechanics of it. Maybe, as Henry Ford said, it is well that we do not, for there will be revolution before tomorrow morning. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? The mechanics of this whole scam is that they received $28.3 trillion, and which you're a surety for, and your children and grandchildren are a surety for, and then we have to pay them a separate interest on top of the interest we got to pay because of the loan, because they gave us permission to print the money. Think of that. That should outrage you. Okay, the Federal Reserve banks are one of the most corrupt institutions the world has ever known. There is not a man within the sound of my voice who does not know that this nation is run by international bankers. Louis T. McFadden, folks, that's 1916. Chairman of the Banking Committee in 1916, telling you then that this country is being run by international bankers. Some and most people think the Federal Reserve banks are United States government institutions. They are not government institutions. They are private credit monopolies which prey upon the people of the United States for the benefit of themselves and their foreign swindlers. Congressional Record 12595, Louis T. McFadden, Chairman of Banking and Currency Committee, June of 1932. Again, do you think this gentleman being in charge of the Banking and Currency Committee at this point for 12 years understands the mechanics of our money system? And you've got to assume he does. And you've got to understand his words. Number one, the Federal Reserves are not U.S. government institutions. They are not government institutions at all. They are private credit monopolies which prey upon the people of these United States for the benefit of themselves and their foreign swindlers. Their foreign swindlers? $3.3 trillion worth of foreign swindling went on with the bailout. And folks, there's more coming. Because we all hear of the pigs, right? Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, Spain. That's the acronym for, in the finance world today, called PIGS, P-I-I-G-S. Excuse me. Folks, all them countries, their currencies crashing. We see it. There are riots in Greece going on as we speak right now. Ireland's banks are about to fail. As a matter of fact, their president and their treasury secretary, minister, excuse me, all made comments last week about their currency just falling. Done. It's over. And I ask you to look at what is the one common denominator of Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain. What's the one common denominator out of everything? I'll tell you what it is. All of them countries' money systems are controlled by the same bankers. The same bankers that control your medium of exchange. And Germany's medium of exchange in the 30s and 20s. And Argentina's medium of exchange in the 90s, when that country went into absolute turmoil and collapsed. Within 2 weeks' time, that country collapsed. It was the jewel of South America. Collapsed. The only common denominator, folks, because we're talking about different continents, we're talking about different times in history, the only common denominator is what? Is what? It's the bankers, the private foreign banking corporations that controlled these countries' currencies. That's the only common denominator. If that's the only common denominator, and what do they control? They controlled it all. They controlled the issuance, they controlled the value, and they've already bled them countries, folks. Spain, the Spanish dollar. This is why we went, one of the reasons why we went backing of silver dollars. This is where we get the term dollar from the country of Spain, because their currency was based on some of the finest silver in the world and the most recognized silver in the world. The bankers bled them. There's nothing backing their currency now. They're bled. There's nothing backing our currency now. And let's talk about that for a second, and we'll go back on to some quotes. Folks, 4 weeks ago now, China and Russia signed a deal that you did not hear about on any of the mainstream media, and it's going to affect your life more than you can ever believe. And let me explain. The American dollar, the reason why it's been the reserve currency of almost every country in the world is that if a nation desired to buy a barrel of oil at any international level and anywhere in the world, they had to take their currency first, exchange it into dollars, purchase the barrel of oil. Okay? They couldn't take the Chinese yuan and go to, say, Russia and buy a barrel of oil from them without exchanging it in the dollar. We set this up years ago, but particularly when we set up OPEC. Wow, did I say we set up OPEC? Yes, I did. 1971, folks, we set up OPEC. We get into that deal tremendously, I don't know, 6 months ago, 5 months ago. We had a show on that. Remember the triangle I described to you? How the American people, we told the Saudi Arabia, we'll protect you militarily, we'll shut down our oil production here in the United States, and we will buy all our oil from you, and you will take a percentage of your earnings, and you will supplement our debt bonds with it. So you got this triangle. You got high oil prices, you got the taxes from the military, and you've got the debt bonds. The American people are paying out at every corner of the triangle. So, what takes place? Besides paying out at the corner of that triangle, the American dollar, even though it's a worthless debt instrument, maintains a certain prestige, if you would, out of necessity, because what? Every country needs oil. Every country needs oil. Whether they produce it domestically or they import it, everybody needs oil. I think we can all agree on that. So 4 weeks ago, China and Russia, they put together a little agreement. It is the biggest energy agreement in the history of the world. And here's how it's going to affect you and how it's going to affect our nation. Because everybody needed a dollar to buy a barrel of oil, like I said, the US dollar held a prestige of necessity internationally. China and Russia, amongst themselves, have decided, you know what? We're all done with exchanging our yuan or our ruble into dollars to have commerce with regards to energy. We're no longer going to do it. There's no reason why we have to. And United States, what are you going to do about it? You understand what I'm saying, folks? So, China and Russia have the largest energy deal in the history of the world. They are not going to use and or facilitate the exchange of the American dollar in the transaction. The rest of the world, folks, is going to look at this and say, why am I? If China and Russia do not need to have the dollar to purchase this barrel of oil, why do I? Why? They really don't, do they, folks? They really, really don't. Especially, what are we going to do with China and Russia? Okay? Folks, you remember April Glaspie, the ambassador to the United States to Iraq in 1991? When Saddam Hussein told Bush 1 that he wanted to go into Kuwait, because before the Balfour Agreement, folks, Kuwait was part of Iraq. Of course, we facilitated the Balfour Agreement also, but that's another topic for another show. And what did April Glaspie in her book deliver personally to Saddam Hussein? The okay to go into Kuwait, but he was not to go into Saudi Arabia. Read her book. April Glaspie, she's the ambassador to the United States in 1991 between the United States and Iraq. This is in her book. She hand-delivered the okay to Hussein. That's why Hussein was so caught off guard, folks, when we intervened the way we did. What was the real reason why we went to war there? After all, we put Saddam Hussein in power in 1959. He did very well for us. When things fell apart with the Shah of Iran, he went to war on our behalf for 8 years on a brutal war against Iran to tie the Iranian forces up. He did exactly what we asked of him. He was completely caught off guard, folks, that we intervened the way we did. Why? Because, one, he had permission from us to go into Kuwait. Here's the real reason, folks. Saddam Hussein had plans and was implementing a currency based on the value of a barrel of oil. What was going to happen? He wasn't going to need American dollars anymore to facilitate oil trade, was he? And would everybody rather have some kind of intrinsic value in their currency, like, say, the barrel of oil? Or would you rather have an instrument that's based on debt? We had to go to war with him. We set him up. He fell for it, hook, line, and sinker, and we stopped that whole bit about him implementing a currency by a barrel of oil. Based on the barrel of oil. That's why we went to war the first time there, folks. And that's also the reason why we didn't go into Baghdad. No need to. Mission accomplished. We're going to control what oil you do export, and we're going to make sure you continue to use a worthless fiat currency internationally. So, because don't forget, folks, 81% of the world's oil goes through where? The Strait of Hormuz. Well done. We went to war for the banksters, and we accomplished what we were set to do under the guise of protecting the people of Kuwait. Isn't that interesting? A couple of years ago, a year and a half ago, I'll give you another example of this. A barrel of oil was $147 a barrel, and it was skyrocketing. And then a gentleman by the name of Lindsey Williams, who was a person that I pay particular attention to, said that in the middle of this, that the barrel of oil is going to come down to $50, $60 a barrel, and it's going to happen within 4 months. Folks, it took about 7 weeks, 8 weeks, and a barrel of oil was down at $55 a barrel from when he made that statement. Amazing what was going on behind the scenes to make this happen. Kuwait, Iran, not Kuwait, Dubai, the UAE, and Iran and some others were getting together, and they were going to do a regional currency again based on the value of the barrel of oil. Well, the international banksters that control our currency approached these people and said, listen, we will finance this, and we will keep the perimeters that as long as oil stays at $80 a barrel, the value will take care of itself. You understand what I'm saying? Because the barrel of oil is worth $80, the currency is based on that, it maintains its level. Oil is at $147 a barrel, skyrocketing weekly. There's no way it's going to go down below $80. They sign on the dotted line. From the day they signed on the dotted line to, like I said, 7 to 8 weeks later, a barrel of oil all of a sudden comes down to $55 a barrel. The whole program of financing on that minimum of $80 a barrel, what happens? It's gone. It's gone. What did the bankers do? They confiscated a lot of the infrastructure and stuff that's going on in Dubai. Folks, do you remember 4 years ago, Dubai was the architect's dream. They were building all these new skyscrapers. I mean, go online and you'll see some of them. They're absolutely beautiful and they're incredible. Go online today, folks, and you will see a tremendous amount of infrastructure sitting idle. Sitting idle. And why is that? Because that currency failed because of the manipulation of the value of the barrel of oil. And Lindsey Williams made this projection when the prices were skyrocketing and everyone's, we're going to be paying $4 a barrel here pretty soon. I mean, $4 a gallon, excuse me. It took him a lot of courage to do this, to make this public statement. But folks, think of the confidence that he had in his statement to go public with it. Why? Because as Lindsey Williams says, I got to rub shoulders with people for 3.5 years that prior to meeting, I did not believe existed. The controllers, the bankers, the very same people who set up OPEC, so you can pay all 3 points of that triangle. And who benefits from that? They do. The debt bonds get sold. They make the money on the sale. They make the money on the interest. They make the money on keeping the big military to protect our interest in the Middle East when we don't need to do that because we got more oil in North and South Dakota and Alaska than we do in Saudi Arabia. Folks, you know where the first oil well was? Believe it or not, it was in the state of Pennsylvania. The first oil well in the world was in a place called Titusville, Pennsylvania, as in Penn Oil. Think of this. We've got wells capped up in Prudhoe Bay. Capped. Think of Bekken, Bacon Basin in North and South Dakota. 36 hours after it was discovered, what happened? The EPA declared it an environmental zone. 36 hours. 36 hours, it was done. No, you're not allowed to drill there. Wait a minute, we just found the largest reserves in the history of man. And you're not going to let us drill there when we're so dependent on foreign oil? No, of course not. Why? Because that triangle would be broken. You wouldn't pay as much. You wouldn't have to pay for the military infrastructure with your cash, your credit, your debt, and your blood. You wouldn't be sending your sons and daughters off to foreign lands to take the Taliban out, would you? No, we wouldn't have no need. Folks, I have never made a prediction on this program, and I'm not doing it now, but I will tell you, this very same gentleman, Lindsey Williams, who predicted that the barrel of oil was going to go from $147 as it's actively skyrocketing every week down to $50 and $60 a barrel in a very short time, and it did that in 7 to 8 weeks, is now saying that the bankers are going the other way with it. That we will be paying this spring $4 for a gallon of gasoline. Now, I do know that in the last 8 days, a gallon of gasoline has gone up by 12 cents. I'm not predicting this, but somebody who, I quote, rubs shoulders with the elite are telling you this is what their plans are. You can do with that information what you wish, but I will tell you this man's track record has been just incredible, just incredible. So this is the reason why this deal with China and Russia is going to affect you personally, folks, because not only are there trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars worldwide of this worthless debt instrument, and the only reason why people, other nations were using it as their reserve currency because they couldn't do the transaction of purchasing of any oil without it. What's going to happen now, folks? If the only reason why I was keeping it as a nation was because I had to buy oil, and I no longer have to buy oil, what am I going to do as a nation with this debt instrument? I'm going to dump it. I'm going to sell it for what I can when I can. What's that going to do to the purchasing power of your pocketbook? You remember last week we showed you that chart from 1913 to last year, 2009? And the purchasing power went from 100% down to 4%. And I told you that if you had a modern chart here from 2010, it would be at 2%. What is going to happen to the dollar when the world finds out about this deal China and Russia have done and no longer purchases oil with the use of the dollar, and it's a debt instrument? They're going to dump it. They're going to dump it, and they're going to dump it. They're going to be running for the exits as quick as they can. This is why so many countries, particularly China, are buying both governmental and with their people so much gold and silver currently. Gold this year is up 28%, and silver is up 64%. Do you think the rest of the world is waking up to our lie, to our facade, to our deception? I think they are. I think the American people better get in tune with the rest of the world and understand what's going on here. Because this agreement is huge, folks. And you would think that the media would have this on every print and radio and media broadcast that there is. And I have my suspicions that the events that have taken place in California 2 weeks ago with the missile launch off the coast of California, with the EMP event off the coast of California, and both domestic and foreign intelligence agencies openly printing and admitting that both China and the United States militaries were involved here? Do you understand what I'm saying to you? The times that we are in, how fragile we are. Folks, the Chinese have a 215 million man in uniform military. We have 289 million people in the entire country. The Chinese have all of our vortex and EMP technology, thanks to the swindling of Bill Clinton back in the 90s. If you remember Johnny Wong and all that, remember he made the comment that the White House is like a subway. All you have to do is fill up the coin slot. Remember him? Remember that? Johnny Wong making the comment of literally describing the White House as a subway, because all you have to do is feed the coin slot. Folks, Bill Clinton gave the Chinese all of our vortex weaponry. He gave the Chinese all of our EMP weaponry. And they've had that since 1996. It's 2010. You think they developed that quite well? I believe they have. And I believe it's one of the main reasons they no longer fear us. And folks, think of this militarily. They have been watching us at war since 1991. They understand our tactics. They understand our logistics. They understand what our thinking, you know, how we try to accomplish things, our operations. They understand our equipment. Folks, they not only understand our equipment, they manufacture most of our equipment. You'll be shocked to find out that the guidance system for the Tomahawk cruise missile, which used to be made in Indiana, is now made in China. Now understand, if you got the guidance system of any entity, I don't care if it's a car, I don't care if it's an airplane, a missile, a ship, I don't care. What do you have to understand about that entity to have the appropriate guidance system? Try everything. You have to understand the mechanics of it, the materials of it. You have to understand the fuel usage of it so you can adapt for as the fuel is used. There's different shifts of weight. You've got to understand everything. So if China is making the guidance system, which they are, for the Tomahawk cruise missile, what do they understand about our Tomahawk cruise missile? Everything. Where it can be launched from, its limitations, its ranges, everything. Everything. They understand it all, folks. They've been watching us since '91. It's like two boxes. What do the folks who are into the UFC and stuff, what do all these guys talk about? NFL, what do they all talk about? Oh, we get, like, Bill Belichick is famous. We get to watch film. We get to watch the film. What are they looking for? They're looking for tactics. They're looking for what works well for them, what doesn't work well for them. What are the things they usually go with? What do they do in different situations? It's the same way with the military, going to battle. And they've been watching us since '91. I got to think they're pretty confident of the outcome should we go to war with China. Which takes me to George Washington's prophecies. And I hope that doesn't come true. I know for the sake of time, I don't have the time to get into all that, but George Washington had a set of prophecies, and they were recorded by his aide-de-camp. And it was rather interesting, but his third prophecy was that basically he sees the United States in ruins. And he hears the remnant was the word he used, hiding in the mountains. He hears the cries of millions throughout the cities from the Pacific to the Atlantic. Folks, the United States was not from the Pacific to the Atlantic at that point. It was 13 colonies. We, folks, this deal with China and Russia is going to have such huge, huge implications on you personally, and you have not even heard about it on the mainstream media. Not once. As a matter of fact, I know a lot of people that watch this program, and I'm proud of you, do some diligent studying. I get comments from people all the time. Tom, great that you brought up, Let me use an example. The Trading with the Enemies Act, amended in 1933, where the United States government declared you and I the enemies of the government. I know that sounds crazy, but we read that verbatim to you on this show. We read it from the congressional record. We read it from the legislative pages. We read it verbatim to you. How the government would never kill 2,844 people at 9/11. Folks, you're the declared enemy of the government in their own writing. Go on the internet. Trading with the Enemies Act, 1933, as amended from the Trading with the Enemies Act of 1917. We read it verbatim. You can't say no. What's 2,844 the enemy to them? Nothing. They're bleeding you. They're soft killing you with cancers, with fluoride, with the chemtrails. Vaccinations, there's mercury in vaccinations. Come on. They're soft killing you, they're hard killing you. Folks, that term soft killing, that's from their own writings. This is what they call the cancers and the Alzheimer's and all the things, how they're implementing this. That's what their own term, soft killing. Punch in the Georgia Guidestones on the internet and you will read what they want to do with the population. I'm not making this up. I am just reporting to you their own writings. So I am proud of the audience of this show. I'm proud that so many of you understand what the Federal Reserve is and, more importantly, what it is not. I'm proud of you that you understand the Hegelian dialectic. I'm proud of you that you are doing your diligence. I am proud. And I'm proud that this show, the people in front of the camera and the behind the camera are all part of this. And we have to understand the mechanics of the money system. We have to understand what we have and what we do not have. Folks, remember me saying this. This China and Russia deal that you have not heard about is going to be, I would say, in the last 40 years, the most detrimental event that's taken place, like I said, in the last 40 years. And remember me saying that. Because the writing is on the wall for the American dollar. Actually, the American dollar died a long time ago. What you perceive is the American dollar. Because there's not 25.8 grains of gold and a 50-to-1 ratio of silver backing it up. We have legal tender, not money. A great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit. Our system of credit is concentrated in the hands of a few men. We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the world. No longer a government of free opinion, no longer a government of conviction and a vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men. Do you remember I said before we ended this show, we were going to give you some of President Wilson, who was responsible for the Federal Reserve Act being implemented at the executive level. This is part of his deathbed confession. He opens it up with, "I am a most unhappy man, for I have unwittingly destroyed my nation." We are completely dependent on the commercial banks. Someone has to borrow every dollar we have in circulation in cash or credit. If the banks create ample synthetic money, we are prosperous. If not, we starve. We are absolutely without a permanent money system. It is the most important subject intelligent persons can investigate and reflect upon. It is so important that our present civilization may collapse unless it becomes widely understood and the defects remedied very soon. This is Robert Hamphill. Now, listen to his position. President of the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank. Do you think this man understands what's going on? Let me read him again. We are completely dependent on our commercial banks. Someone has to borrow every dollar we have in circulation in cash and or credit. If the banks create ample synthetic money, we are prosperous. If not, we starve. We are absolutely without a permanent money system. It is the most important subject intelligent persons can investigate and reflect upon. It is so important that our present civilization may collapse unless it becomes widely understood and the defects are remedied very soon. Robert Hanfield, Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank President. Folks, I just can't say any more. I mean, these are the people who are in the system. These are the people who are at the top of the system. These are the beautiful people, as we say. Is Mr. Hanfield being honest here and open and reflection? Absolutely. What is he telling you is the most important issue of our civilization, and that our civilization may collapse unless it becomes widely understood and the defects are remedied shortly. Now, we talked about the purchasing power. Oh, you got. This is all new. Okay, hold on. I didn't know what you guys are doing. All right. All right. Let me start. I didn't know what you guys were doing.
I went out to find out how much time was left. He said you were over.
Okay. Then I'm going to close. Folks, this is from the chairman, the president of the Atlanta Federal Reserve System. You've heard quotes from Louis T. McFadden, chairman of the Banking and Currency Committee when the Federal Reserve Act was developed. You don't have to take my word from it, folks. You can take it from the people's words who were part of the organization, part of the implementation, and part of the mechanisms of the system that is about to collapse. With that being said, folks, again, we are very thankful that you take the time from your busy day to join us. And as always, we remind you that your government is your responsibility. Thank you for watching.